in late 2025, something pretty remarkable happened. More than 20 world leaders all descended on Tianjin, China, for what was billed as the biggest summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization ever. But, this wasn't just another series of handshakes and photo ops. No, this was a statement, a really powerful one. The big question is, what exactly were they trying to tell the world?
To really get what this summit was all about, you have to start with a pretty basic question in geopolitics. What happens when powerful countries start to feel like their backs are against the wall, when they feel cornered by economic and political pressure?
Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, and it's the key to this whole story. They start looking for new friends, even if those new friends used to be old rivals. Okay, let's really get into this. Because the Tianjin Summit didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was a direct response to some massive global pressures, which ended up being the perfect catalyst for a very, very unlikely alliance. And the main pressure point? It really all came down to a shared economic headache. We're talking about a wave of U.S. trade tariffs, including a really steep 50% package hitting Indian exports, and of course, similar threats aimed at China. This kind of economic pressure created a powerful shared reason for these nations to, well, circle the wagons. And the stage they chose for this was the SCO. Now, this group started out as a way to handle old post-Soviet border issues, but it's grown into this massive Eurasian bloc. The whole thing is built on this idea they call the Shanghai spirit, which is all about mutual trust, talking things out, and growing together.
So, with the scene set by all this outside pressure, the East gathered in Tianjin. And this was way more than just a meeting. It was deliberately framed as this big, bold statement of global South solidarity.
I mean, the sheer scale of it was just unprecedented. You had more than 20 world leaders, all hosted by China's President Xi Jinping. This was all about projecting strength, unity, and the idea that there's an alternative to a Western-led world.
And just look at who was in the room and why. For China, it was about pushing this vision of a new world order. For Russia, it was about breaking out of its isolation. For India, it was this really tricky balancing act, trying to handle U.S. tariffs while also patching things up with China. And for Iran, it was about finding allies against sanctions. You can see how all their different needs suddenly pointed in the same direction. But the real headline, the story happening right at the heart of the summit, was the potential comeback of a really powerful and, let's be honest, historically complicated alliance, the Russia-India-China troika. This RIC idea has been floating around for decades. People have often called it a marriage of convenience because there's always been this deep mistrust, especially between India and China. But now, in 2025, all that shared pressure from the West suddenly gave this old idea a brand new, very powerful reason to exist.
So, that raises a big question, right? If this trio really does get its act together, what are we actually looking at? I mean, just how big of a deal is this potential bloc?
Well, for starters, just think about the people. Demographically, these three nations alone make up almost 38% of the entire human population. That is a staggering number.
And then there's the money. Economically, they're responsible for about a third of the world's total output. And that's measured in what's called purchasing power parity, which is just a fancy way of saying we're comparing what people's money can actually buy at home.
And financially, they're sitting on a combined $4.7 trillion in foreign reserves. That is an immense war chest that gives them a huge amount of leverage in the global financial game. So here it is, all laid out. A combined GDP of almost $54 trillion, over 3 billion people, and military spending that's about a fifth of the global total. You put all that together, and the sheer weight of this trio is absolutely enough to create a whole new center of gravity in world affairs.
But look, big numbers are one thing. What made this summit really fascinating was the human drama, the actual diplomacy. And it all centered on one critical moment, the meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and China's President Xi Jinping.
This was the money quote from their joint statement. Differences should not turn into disputes. Now, that might sound like just bland diplomatic speak, but trust me, after years of intense border clashes and total mistrust, this one sentence was a huge, deliberate signal of a change in tone. It was a public promise to handle things differently.
And this didn't just happen on a whim. This was the result of a solid year of grinding diplomatic work. You go from the absolute deep freeze after the 2020 border clashes to them sharing a stage at BRICS to their ministers' meeting. It shows this thaw was built step by step, very carefully.
So, does all of this actually add up to a new world order?
That is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Let's take a look at the SCO's big ambitions and then weigh them against some of the messy realities on the ground.
One of the biggest pieces of their economic puzzle is this proposed SCO development bank. And let's be clear, the goal here is not subtle at all. It's to create a whole new financial system, a new way to make payments, specifically to challenge the dominance of the US dollar and Western banks.
So how are they going to do it? Well, their strategy basically boils down to a three-step plan. First, build the new plumbing, the infrastructure, with things like this new bank. Second, start using it to trade with each other in their own currencies. And third, the ultimate prize, slowly but surely become less and less dependent on the US dollar to do business.
Now, on the security side of things, the SCO's official job description is pretty clear. On paper, it was created to fight what they call the three evils: terrorism, separatism, and extremism. That's their stated mission for keeping the region safe.
But this is where things get really complicated. Because while the goal is for everyone to act together, the reality is that old rivalries, especially the one between India and Pakistan, often throw a wrench in the works. For instance, India actually refused to sign a joint statement on terrorism because it felt its own specific concerns were being ignored. It's a perfect example of how national interests can still bring the whole group to a standstill.
Which brings us right back to the final, crucial question. Look, the 2025 SCO Summit was, without a doubt, a landmark event. It was a clear signal that the world is changing. But was it the actual beginning of a new institutionalized multipolar order? Or was it, as some people argue, just a masterclass in really powerful optics? A show designed to send a message while the truly hard work of fixing all the internal cracks still lies ahead. That's the question the summit left hanging in the air.